The road belongs to those who travel along it. It has been 30 years since anyone traveled along the road that the Transylvanian Saxons traveled for 8 centuries. This road is now far from the main street of history, but has every opportunity to return to it. As an outstanding civilization and cultural program of medieval Europe, the Hungarian kings, Géza II and András II, relocated people from the central Rhine and Moselle regions and present-day Belgium and Luxembourg to the south of Transylvania, forming the ancestors of the Transylvanian Saxons, to boost the region economically and provide border protection. The latter was vital due to the Tatar and later Ottoman attacks. In return, the newcomers received self-determination and far-reaching privileges. It took the Saxons less than a century to turn the 8,000-kilometer square region stretching from Alba Iulia to Brasov of Kogisboden, meaning the King's Land, a region similar in size to the Greek island Crete, into one of the most thriving regions along the Carpathian Basin, separated from the coherent German-speaking area 1,000 kilometers to the east. From the 13th century onwards, the Saxons surrounded their towns with walls reinforced with tall towers, protecting against the Tatar and Ottoman invasions. In the villages, they constructed fortified churches, protected by walls, also used as provision storage. This unique fortified church construction, of which 160 still stand, have remained a trademark of the Saxon region of Transylvania. Mediaș is a town of 45,000 people, sitting on the banks of the river Târnava Mare. In the second half of the 13th century, it was already inhabited by the Saxons, who, in 1545, declared here their affiliation with the Lutheran denomination. From the middle of the 16th century, it was a free royal city, housing several Transylvanian parliaments. By the end of the 17th century, more than 30 guilds made up the city's masters, such as the farriers, shoemakers, butchers, tailors, belt manufacturers, coopers, and curriers. Their industry has continued to develop to this day. Its main attraction is one of the most significant Transylvanian Gothic works, the Lutheran Church, particularly its tower, which is a symbol of the city. The church is surrounded by a wall, fortified with 5 towers. In addition to the German-speaking Stefan Ludwig Roth Grammar School and Hermann Oberoth Primary School, the Hungarian-speaking Báthori István Primary School still operates in Mediaș, where the population is 10% Hungarian. In many places on the rooftops, you can see the original vents shaped like eyes, as if they are watching over and guarding the city. These characteristic architectural motifs can also be found in other Saxon cities, including Sighișoara and Sibiu. A multitude of cultural events ensure that the city's streets and squares come to life. Every year, the festivals attract tens of thousands of foreign tourists to Mediaș. "20 kilometers from Mediaș, among picturesque hills, lies Rikiș. It's first mentioned in writing in 1283. As a free Saxon village of the Chair of Mediaș, and later a market town, Rikiș was considered a rich settlement due to its wine production. Its Lutheran fortress church, constructed in the 14th to 15th century, was modeled after the Episcopal Church in Sibiu, and built in the same late Gothic style. The guardian of the church is the last Saxon inhabitant of the village, the elderly Johann Schoss, who is more than happy to show visitors around. A few years ago, a short film was made about the village of Rikiș, making it famous. There are now homeowners in the village from dozens of countries around the world, including Switzerland, the Netherlands, and the US, with temporary and permanent residents among the 700 people of Rikiș. You can clearly see the road is closed off from residential lots by high stone fences, as if each house was a small fortress of its own. The wide streets and ample public spaces are also typical architectural features of the Saxon villages in Transylvania. Biertan is located between Mediaș and Sighișoara, 9 kilometers south of the main road connecting the two towns, hidden among the nearly 600-meter tall hills. Presumably, it had already been inhabited by Saxons before the Tatar invasion between 1241 and 1242. In the first half of the 16th century, as a market town, competed with Mediaș for the rank of the center of two chairs. For 300 years, Biertan was the headquarters for the Lutheran bishop of Saxon Transylvania. Following the final emigration of the Saxon population after 1990, the former Lutheran bishop headquarters parish was abolished in 1997. Biertan prides itself for having one of the most beautiful fortified churches in Transylvania. Its winged altar holds 28 pictures, making it not only the most beautiful, but the largest in Transylvania. In the middle of the 16th century, the teachings of Martin Luther fell on fertile soil in Transylvania. The prayer of the Wittenberg reformer, "A strong castle is our God, our good weapon and shield," has not taken on any tangible form anywhere in the world the way it has in the impregnable fortified churches of Saxon Transylvania. Mallinckrodt lies 32 kilometers southwest of Sighișoara. It is also called the last Saxon village, since the settlement of 1,100 people still has a German-speaking population of about 150, including young people and children. The Lutheran pastor Joachim Lorenz and his family played a huge role in this. After moving to Mallinckrodt from Germany in 1992, he began teaching the language of the original inhabitants of the village with great passion and patience, regardless of origin or mother tongue. For about 470 years from the beginning of the 1300s, Mallinckrodt was the estate center for one of the oldest noble families in Transylvania, the Apathes. Its Lutheran church was built with 3 connected grand halls. It had one of the earliest winged altars in Transylvania and still holds its place today. Although most medieval church frescoes were whitewashed in most places during the Reformation, or were severely damaged and destroyed during later reconstructions. The frescoes from the 14th century fortified church in Mallinckrodt remain in excellent condition, a rarity in Transylvania. The Gothic painting style of the frescoes refers to a South Tyrolean origin that may have come to Transylvania through Czech mediation. The original Apathy mansion stands beside this fortified church and dates back to the end of the 16th century. Today, the building serves tourist purposes. It is definitely worth the climb up the hillside opposite the fortified church to lay eyes on the tombstones in the cemetery, complete with all German names and Gothic inscriptions. A unique feeling washes over people when they see them. A foothold of German land in the embrace of the Carpathian Basin. Anyone who hasn't yet will soon realize how much loss Transylvania truly suffered with the departure of the Saxons. "40 kilometers east of Mediaș, still on the shore of the river Tarn Mare, lies Sighișoara, a town of 25,000 with a Hungarian population of around 20%. In the Roman Empire, it was known as Stanarum. The storms of history have not spared this region over the centuries. However, throughout this time, it has remained well known for its craftsmanship. Of the castle's original 14 towers, 9 remain standing today, connected by a 930-meter-long castle wall. Each tower bears the name of a guild designated for its defense. The bronze and tin craftsmen, carpenters, stonemasons, barbers, locksmith, weavers, and coopers making up these guilds have aged the city's reputation for centuries. Its famous clock tower, imitated by several other fortified churches in Saxon Transylvania, was built in the 14th century. Silver statues of the 12 apostles walk around its musical clock. Near the castle's church is the former Saxon Lutheran grammar school, the Bergschule, which is still partly German-speaking. The castle hill can be reached by a staircase made up of 178 steps, originally built in 1642. One of the most beautiful medieval castle districts in Transylvania, preserved in its original form and inhabited to this day, can be found within the walls of the Sighișoara Castle. It is no coincidence that the tourists who view and take pictures of this World Heritage Site belong to the cityscape all year round. "11 kilometers south of Sighișoara, along the banks of the Segeș Brook, we find the village of Apold, with a population of 1,000. It is first mentioned in written sources in 1309. It was here, in 1836, that Michael Albert, known as the greatest poet of the Saxons, was born. The village's Gothic fortified church is surrounded by a double defensive wall, which is further strengthened by 2 towers within the wall and 4 outside. Sebastian Bethke, who moved here from Berlin in 2004, has invaluable merits in preserving and improving the condition of this fortified church. As he has said, he prefers life in the village because, unlike in the city, he can breathe freely here. His carpentry profession is of great use here. He is pleased that after years of staying in Poland, Russia, and the Ukraine, he has finally found his home here in Apold. Stejarishu is positioned on the other side of the east-west mountain range that makes up the borders of Malincrav. The village of about 500 people was originally situated on both sides of the Hurtibaci River, but later moved up higher due to frequent flooding. In 1223, it became the property of the provostship of Sibiu, which is where it got its name. Dr. Barbara Schiffnagel, social attaché of the Austrian embassy in Bucharest, has been operating from the village since 2006. Since the Great Flood of 1970, the diplomat from Vienna has been in close contact with Transylvania. Her leadership improved the livelihood of the locals by turning former parish, daycare, and school buildings into locksmith and carpentry workshops, conference centers, and guest houses. As in other villages, following the emigration of the native Saxon population, the condition of residential and monumental buildings began to rapidly deteriorate due to the lack of proper care and maintenance. However, despite this deterioration, Sejarisu is one of the luckier settlements. The few Saxon residents who remain took over the care of the Lutheran fortified church in addition to maintaining their own properties. This Gothic-style fortified church was built in the 14th century, with its first tower being raised around 1500. By the 16th century, the church was surrounded by a double wall, the inner of which was reinforced with one more tower. After the final expulsion of the Ottomans from the Carpathian Basin in the 18th century, the military significance of the fortified churches came to an end. Some of the outer walls were demolished, but the towers continued to be maintained to this day. The fortified churches became a symbol of Saxon cultural identity in Transylvania. Leaving the main road from Sighișoara towards Brașov, 6 kilometers from Kriț, we find ourselves in Meschendorf. The settlement is first mentioned under this name in a document from 1332. Its Gothic fortified church was built in the 14th century. The Financial Times also wrote about this picturesque village of about 300 to 400 people in an article recommending Transylvania as the new Tuscany for exploration to its readers. In addition to the preserved Saxon-built heritage, the world's leading economic and financial daily newspaper is particularly enthusiastic about its easily accessible forests and fields, homemade food, and the nature-based lifestyle, which has long since disappeared from the West. In fact, with its colorful gingerbread-like houses, neat fortified church, and original village image, the tiny storybook village of Meschendorf captivates the traveler's hearts at first sight. "15 kilometers from Meschendorf lies the 300-person village of Mediaș. Its Gothic hall church dates from the 14th century and was fortified in the early 16th century with an oval castle wall, 5 towers, and a forecourt. On February 14, 2016, the fortress church collapsed. A significant portion of the walls collapsed along with the bell tower, but the roof miraculously remained in place. Transylvanian-born German rock star Peter Maffay started a foundation that has been operating in this village since 2009 as a safe haven for children experiencing difficult times. Several other German foundations are working to revitalize the village, renovate and bring to life the fortress church, parish, as well as other buildings. The London-based Mihai Eminescu Trust helps locals preserve the image of their historic village. In the neighborhood of Meschendorf and Mediaș, we find the 700-person Viskri, the model village of Saxon Transylvania. Its first inhabitants were settlers before the Saxons settled here in the early 13th century. The Gothic fortified church, which still defines the image of the village from afar, dates back to the 15th century and is one of the most beautiful churches in Transylvania. The castle church is surrounded by a 2-story covered wall, which encloses spacious storage areas and is strengthened by 6 imposing towers. The multi-story towers open into narrowing portholes in all directions, through which a wonderful panorama of the village and the stunning surrounding landscape can be seen. Today, the fortified church, which also houses a museum presenting the Saxon past, is one of the most popular tourist attractions in Transylvania. The village and the fortress church, which have preserved their medieval charm with exceptional success, have been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1999, like the old town of Sigishwara and the fortress of Biertan. The Mihai Eminescu Trust in London also operates here. It helps the locals produce woolen products for German exports and work to further preserve the original village image with the support of the British heir, Prince Charles, who also bought a house in Viskry and regularly visits the village. The area is great to tour on horseback or by bike, even as an organized event. Accommodation is easy to find, as most families are involved in the rural tourism. Falmer is located 40 kilometers from Viskry. Meanwhile, we pass through Velen, which today only has a few Hungarian residents, and can take a detour to Granair, which has remained a Hungarian village. Falmer, with a population of 400 to 500, remained a Saxon village from the 13th century until the 1990s. Its fortified church was originally constructed in the Romanesque style, and then rebuilt in the 15th century in accordance with Gothic style features, and its tower was finished in 1795. Even today, in its ruined state, the fortress remains an imposing sight. Its protective wall is reinforced by polygonal towers. In 1909, a school was built on the site of a section of the defensive wall. The condition of the fortified church is now approaching life-threatening. The so-called Bacon Bastion still has the original hooks, and the individual house numbers can be seen inscribed on them. The Saxons kept their food reserves here, carefully indicating which piece of the bacon belonged to which family. Unfortunately, the building of the former school and town hall next to the fortress seem to have begun irreversibly decaying. Five kilometers of winding mountain roads from Falmer lead to Kobor, a Hungarian village rich in history. Kobor is the earliest settlement mentioned among today's Brașov County in written sources, the ancient equivalent of its name first appearing in documents from 1206. A century prior to today, it consisted of 1,000 reformed Hungarian inhabitants. Its landmark and main attraction is the fortified church built in the Saxon Lutheran style. Kobor has completely depopulated several times over the centuries, yet it has always been repopulated and still retains its Hungarian culture. Unfortunately, since 1920, its population has been steadily declining. Today, only 200 inhabitants remain, of which barely a third is Hungarian, and of those, most are over 60 years old. Very few young and middle-aged people live in the village on their own, which is especially true for the Hungarian residents of Kobor, among whom there are only a handful around the age of 18, and no children who speak Hungarian at all. The village was always far from the railway and main roads. Even today it can only be reached on poor quality side roads from the two neighboring villages, Felmer and Tikishu. If a resident has an errand in one of the nearest cities, Rupia or Fogoros, they must be prepared for a 40-minute bumpy drive. There is a lack of regular and reliable public transportation. These conditions have contributed greatly to the emigration of the working-age population. The survival of their Hungarian culture depends largely on the renovation of the rapidly deteriorating fortified church. This goal is financially supported in part by the government of Hungary, offering significant funds. A Hungarian guest house is also being built in the village, where people traveling to the bordering castles of the Carpathian Basin could stay. Halfway from Kobor to Sibiu, we find Gerdeal. Our journey's most mysterious stop could have been described as our saddest stop a few years ago. The settlement, which dates back 700 years, is isolated from the outside world, away from other villages, among hills covered with dense forest, and there is only one bumpy gravel road leading to the village. The village is practically completely extinct, with a permanent population of less than 10. In many places, houses stand empty by streets overgrown with vegetation. A few years ago, the open gates were pushed by the wind. In some windows, old black and white wedding photos hanging on the wall were visible. The ghost town's two-story school's floor collapsed, and darkness loomed behind its broken windows. The furnishings of an old shop were waiting for their fate in complete disarray. The village was nearing total extinction until a few years ago, when, thanks to the internet, the world learned its name and several television crews from the West began filming the region. Thanks to the power of the public, the devastation seems to have come to a halt in the past 1 or 2 years. By the fall of 2019, the school's structural integrity had been improved, and several houses began undergoing renovations. A large modern boarding house has also been constructed in the village. However, the question of for who remains. Hosman lies on the banks of the Hurtabachi River, an approximately half-hour drive from Sibiu. This is the site of one of the most successful village revitalization projects in Transylvania. The main attraction of the village is the fortified church constructed at the end of the 13th century, which still stands tall over the houses. In the background, the over 2,500-meter towering mountain peaks of the Fogarosh Mountains, covered by snowcaps, sparkle until early summer. Following the mass exodus of the Saxons 30 years ago, Haussmann offered cheap access to traditionally built houses and the land that came with them, up until recently. Taking advantage of this, German and Austrian foundations and associations settled in the village, working to revitalize it through social and cultural activities. Their main task is to maintain, renovate, and replenish the fortress, as well as its associated buildings, including the former school, the parish, the pastoral residence, and the bell ringer's lodge. One of the most important institutions and sites in Haussmann is the Old Mill, which has remained operational since 1932 and to this day employs several locals. The head of the mill is Luisa Boldizsár, one of the Hungarian residents of the village. The modernized cultural barn awaits its guests with their events all year round. The Holstock Music Festival, held in August, takes place in the inner courtyard of the fortress, offering the younger generations a prime opportunity to familiarize themselves with village life. Sibiu, or Hermannstadt, was once the largest city as well as the cultural and commercial center of Saxon Transylvania. Today, the county town of Sibiu County is home to a population of 150,000 and is a large city with a vibrant cultural life all year round. Its international airport and the A1 South Transylvanian motorway connect it directly to the European circulation. In the Middle Ages, its inhabitants built a complex system of defense against the Tatar and Ottoman invasions. It was protected by multiple concentric rings of defensive walls, ditches connected to the surrounding marshy, swampy terrain, a system of dams allowing controlled flooding as well as draining, and 39 towers. With this strategic system, Sibiu was the largest fortified city in the Kingdom of Hungary the Ottomans could never occupy. Some of the old defensive lines can still be seen today. The best preserved part is the Strada Citații, where you can walk or cycle between the 3rd and 4th castle walls in the former moat. In the 16th century, it was one of the centers of the Transylvanian Reformation. In 1529, the first Transylvanian book printing workshop was established here. Its Gothic cathedral was built in the 15th to 16th centuries and became a Lutheran church after the Reformation. In front of it stands the statue of Saxon bishop Georg Daniel Teutsch. Opposite the church is the Samuel von Bruckenthal High School, the city's German language secondary school. In 2007, Sibiu was chosen as the European Capital of Culture next to Luxembourg, and at this time underwent a major development. In the once largest Saxon city, now only 1.6% of the population is German, which is lower than the number of Hungarians residing here. As a result of the mass emigration following the 1989 Romanian Revolution, the number of Germans in Romania, along with the Saxons and the Swabians from Banat, Szatmár, and Crișana, has reduced from 800,000 to a peak of 10,000. The unique cultural heritage built and protected for over 8 centuries began to deteriorate in only a few decades, with very few refreshing exceptions. Historia est magistra vitae. History is the teacher of life, wrote Cicero. Let the example of the Saxons of Transylvania stand before us and the generations to come as a lesson. Let us remain faithful to our homeland, since we are all only given one native land. Let us preserve the spiritual and material values inherited from our ancestors and pass them on to future generations, because they form the basis of our identity. Let us take control of our own destiny and not expect those who are mightier and richer than us to take care of our future. And to never forget all this, let's get up and begin our journey through the remaining memories of the once flourishing Transylvanian Saxon culture while we still can.